desert has no mercy. It burns by day, freezes by night, and swallows machines whole beneath shifting dunes. But in 1941, that endless wilderness, stretching from the Libyan coast to the Egyptian frontier, became the stage for one of the most breathtaking campaigns in military history. At that time, the balance of power in North Africa hung by a thread. The Italian army, battered and retreating after a series of defeats at British hands, was collapsing fast. The British Commonwealth's Western Desert Force, lean, aggressive, and mobile, had swept through Cyrenaica in Operation Compass, capturing over 100,000 Italian prisoners and threatening to drive the Axis out of Africa entirely. For Adolf Hitler, this was more than a minor front. Control of North Africa meant control of the Mediterranean lifeline, and ultimately the Suez Canal, Britain's vital artery to India and the East. If the Axis lost Africa, they lost a continent's worth of strategy. If they won it, they could turn south toward the oil of the Middle East and choke Britain from its empire. To salvage the front, Berlin dispatched a small expeditionary force, modest in size, but entrusted to one man whose boldness had already defied conventional command, Erwin Rommel. When Rommel landed in Tripoli on February 12, 1941, the desert was still foreign to German forces. The Afrika Korps numbered only a few thousand men at the start, a mix of the 5th Light Division and 15th Panzer Division, supported by scattered Italian units. They were short on tanks, short on fuel, and operating at the end of a supply line that stretched across the Mediterranean and through seas prowled by British submarines and aircraft. And yet, from the moment Rommel stepped onto African soil, his instincts were unmistakable. Attack, move, surprise, never wait. He saw opportunity where others saw weakness. The British had halted to reorganize after their victories. Supply depots were overextended. Reconnaissance was thin. Rommel knew what he had to do: strike fast, strike far, and strike where the enemy least expects it. Within weeks of arrival, he began probing the British lines around El Agheila. He ignored orders to hold position and launched a counteroffensive. What followed was a textbook demonstration of his philosophy of war: rapid movement, psychological deception, and relentless momentum. His tanks advanced under cover of sandstorms, his reconnaissance units bypassed enemy strongpoints, and his light armored columns drove deep into British rear areas before their commanders could even comprehend the scale of the assault. It was a storm of movement, unpredictable, precise, and devastating. British communications broke down. Outposts vanished. Commanders radioed in confusion. Enemy tanks everywhere. We cannot locate their main body. That was Rommel's art, the art of the Ghost Division. The name had been earned a year earlier, in 1940, when his 7th Panzer Division cut through France with astonishing speed, often disappearing from its own army's maps. Now, in the blinding white expanse of Libya, that legend was reborn. Allied soldiers soon found themselves facing a phantom opponent, one that moved faster than reports could track, that struck from directions thought impassable and vanished just as quickly. By April 1941, Rommel had turned the tables completely. His Afrika Korps surged across Cyrenaica, recapturing Benghazi, Machili, and eventually laying siege to the key fortress port of Tobruk. What had begun as a desperate reinforcement turned into a full-scale Axis resurgence. For the British, it was a nightmare. An enemy who seemed to appear out of nowhere, attacking convoys, encircling brigades, and shattering lines of communication. For his own men, Rommel became a living symbol of daring and speed, often seen standing in his command vehicle, goggles up, scanning the horizon while under fire. He commanded not from the rear, but from the front, a general who felt every shock of battle firsthand. But beneath the triumphs, cracks were already forming. Every kilometer advanced meant another kilometer stretched from the supply ports at Tripoli. The farther east Rommel pushed, the longer his convoys had to travel across exposed desert routes. Fuel shortages began to bite, mechanical failures increased, and the Italian supply network, never designed for such speed, struggled to keep up. Still, for the moment, victory was all that mattered. In the spring of 1941, the British were reeling. Tobruk was under siege, and the name Rommel had become a whisper that moved faster than the wind. A name the Allied troops would soon learn to fear. The Desert Thunder had begun, and with it, the legend of the Ghost Division reborn under a blazing African sun. By the summer of 1941, the North African desert had become a proving ground of nerve and endurance. Rommel's early counteroffensive had stunned the British, but it was only the beginning of a campaign that would test every element of man and machine. The heat was merciless, the distances unimaginable, and the balance between success and collapse was measured in barrels of fuel and drops of water. For Rommel, every move was a gamble. He was fighting not only the British Eighth Army, but the limits of his own logistics. Yet he thrived under that tension. The desert, empty and unpredictable, rewarded speed and intuition more than numbers. Rommel understood that better than anyone. While Allied commanders often waited for orders, Rommel moved on instinct, taking risks that defied conventional military logic. He pushed forward with lightning raids, using his reconnaissance units to find gaps, then driving armored spearheads through them before the enemy could react. His leadership style was direct and fearless. He traveled constantly between frontline units in his command car, a modified Horch, or captured British staff vehicle, standing upright with binoculars in hand. Soldiers who saw him described his presence as electric. A general who shared their danger, who knew the terrain, who demanded the impossible yet inspired men to attempt it. His columns would advance across the sand in long, snaking trails, trucks, half-tracks, and tanks coated in dust, always pressing toward the horizon. Rommel's tactics relied on deception as much as aggression. He used the desert's vastness to conceal his movements, feinting attacks in one direction before striking in another. He made clever use of reconnaissance reports and aerial observation, often acting on fragmentary intelligence with uncanny accuracy. Even his use of captured British vehicles and uniforms added to the confusion. Entire Allied patrols were ambushed by convoys they mistook for their own. His enemies began to call his maneuvers ghost operations, where columns vanished and reappeared in impossible places. The siege of Tobruk became the central struggle of 1941. For months, the fortress city, garrisoned by Australian and British troops, held out against constant Axis assaults. The port was vital. Whoever controlled Tobruk controlled the supply routes along the coast. Rommel threw division after division at its defenses, supported by relentless artillery and Stuka dive bombers screaming down from the sky. Yet Tobruk refused to fall. The defenders dug in deep, enduring bombardment and heat that warped metal and melted men's will. The Afrika Korps fought with ferocity, but every attack consumed fuel, ammunition, and lives that could not easily be replaced. Rommel's frustration grew, but so did his legend. The German propaganda machine hailed him as a new Hannibal, a commander who could conjure victory from chaos. Even the British press acknowledged his brilliance, calling him the Desert Fox. He seemed everywhere at once, striking deep behind lines, rescuing trapped units, rallying broken ones. His name became synonymous with momentum. For the men who served under him, Morale was high despite shortages. They believed in their commander's genius, convinced that with Rommel, victory was only one daring maneuver away. As the year wore on, the British regrouped. Reinforcements arrived from India, South Africa, and the Commonwealth. The Eighth Army began planning a counter-offensive, Operation Crusader, designed to break the siege of Tobruk and push the Axis back toward Tripolitania. The British had learned from their defeats. They emphasized coordination between armor and infantry, better logistics, and air superiority. But Rommel was already watching. He anticipated their buildup and prepared his own response. When Operation Crusader began in November 1941, the desert erupted once again. British armored brigades advanced across hundreds of miles, clashing with German panzer regiments in swirling tank battles where dust clouds blinded gunners and machine oil mixed with sand. The fighting was fierce and confused, both sides claiming victories, both suffering losses. For days, it was a chaotic blur of movement and counterattack. Rommel countered with characteristic boldness. He drove his remaining forces around the British flanks, threatening their supply lines and communications. At one point, cut off and outnumbered, he led a counter-thrust that nearly encircled the British Eighth Army headquarters itself. But the weight of numbers finally began to tell. British reserves kept coming. German fuel and ammunition did not. After weeks of fighting, the Afrika Korps was forced to pull back. The siege of Tobruk was lifted. For Rommel, it was the first major setback in Africa. Yet even in retreat, his troops fought with discipline and skill, conducting one of the most orderly withdrawals of the war. They fell back to Alamein, regrouped, and prepared again. The British advance had cost them dearly, but the Afrika Korps still existed, battered but unbroken. And Rommel, analyzing every move of his opponents, was already planning the next strike. Through that hard year, his reputation grew from that of a daring commander to a near-mythic figure. The Allies studied him with equal measures of respect and fear. The Axis revered him as the embodiment of the modern warrior. Calm under fire, relentless in pursuit, utterly devoted to the offensive spirit. His superiors, including Hitler, admired his audacity but often feared his independence. Rommel did not always follow orders. He followed the logic of the battlefield. By early 1942, he was ready to resume the offensive. He had learned every curve of the desert, every ridge and wadi, every mirage and shadow that could conceal a maneuver. The British thought him contained. They were wrong. In the coming months, Rommel would unleash one of the most astonishing counterblows of the entire war, one that would carry him to the gates of Egypt and the height of his legend. The desert had forged him, hardened his men, and taught him the rhythm of movement. Out of the heat and dust, Erwin Rommel had become something larger than a general. He was the pulse of the Desert War itself, swift, unpredictable, and seemingly unstoppable. By the beginning of 1942, the desert had quieted, but only on the surface. Both armies were rearming, resupplying, and recovering from the brutal seesaw of the previous year. In the dunes west of Alamein, Rommel's Afrika Korps waited like a coiled spring. Despite the losses of Operation Crusader, his divisions had regained strength. New panzers, fresh crews, and improved supply convoys from Italy gave him the tools for another strike. Across the front, the British Eighth Army under General Neil Ritchie fortified defensive lines, confident that the Axis was too exhausted to attack again. They underestimated Rommel. He struck in January 1942. His counteroffensive began with feints and probing attacks that disguised the main thrust until it was too late. His armor surged eastward in a classic flanking move, bypassing strong points and cutting deep into British rear areas. Within days, the British front began to collapse. Units that had advanced so confidently months before now retreated toward Gazala and Tobruk under constant pressure. Rommel's timing was perfect. He exploited every weakness, advancing hundreds of miles in a campaign that stunned both his allies and enemies. By late spring, the stage was set for one of the most complex and decisive armored battles of the entire North African campaign, the Battle of Gazala. The British had built a chain of fortified boxes defended by infantry and artillery, stretching from the coast inland across the desert. Behind them waited powerful armored reserves. It was, in theory, an unbreakable defense. Rommel saw something different, an opportunity to use mobility and deception once again. On the night of May 26, 1942, he launched Operation Venezia, a sweeping maneuver designed to outflank the British line from the south. His panzer divisions, accompanied by fast reconnaissance units and Italian armor, moved silently under cover of darkness. At dawn, they appeared far behind the British front, cutting off supply routes and creating panic. Allied intelligence was confused. Reports came from every direction, and none agreed on the Axis's true position. The Ghost Division spirit had returned in full. The fighting at Gazala was chaotic and brutal. Sandstorms turned daylight into haze, engines overheated, and tanks vanished in clouds of dust. Both sides fought at point-blank range in swirling engagements where visibility dropped to a few meters. Rommel directed operations from his command vehicle, radioing rapid orders to exploit every breach. For over 2 weeks, the desert was an inferno of fire and movement. British formations were hammered piecemeal. Entire brigades were surrounded and destroyed. By June 21st, the fortress of Tobruk, which had withstood siege for 8 months the year before, fell in a single day. 33,000 Allied soldiers were taken prisoner. It was Rommel's greatest victory. Berlin celebrated, and Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal, the youngest in the German army. Yet, the promotion came with a cost. Rommel knew his position was precarious. His supplies were again dwindling, his tanks worn from months of non-stop fighting, and his lines of communication stretched dangerously thin. Still, momentum drove him forward. He wanted Egypt. In July 1942, he pressed eastward into Egypt's western desert. His troops, exhausted but confident, pursued the retreating Eighth Army toward El Alamein, only 60 miles from Alexandria. The Suez Canal seemed within reach. But here, the desert changed. The ground narrowed between the Qattara Depression and the Mediterranean Sea, creating a natural choke point. There was no room for maneuver, no space to outflank. The British, now under new command, first Auchinleck, then Bernard Montgomery, chose this place to stand. Rommel attacked again and again. His tanks pushed against entrenched lines bristling with anti-tank guns, minefields, and artillery. The summer heat was unbearable. Vehicles broke down faster than they could be repaired. Fuel convoys from Italy were sunk by Allied aircraft and submarines. For the first time, Rommel's greatest weapon, speed, was neutralized. The battles of July and August turned into grinding contests of attrition that he could not win. Still, he fought with unyielding determination. He reorganized depleted battalions, personally inspecting frontline positions. His men called him the Old Man, with respect. They saw him sharing their rations, sleeping in the sand, enduring the same hardship. He improvised defenses, counterattacked when possible, and refused to abandon his forward spirit even as circumstances turned against him. By October 1942, Montgomery had rebuilt the Eighth Army into a force of overwhelming strength, superior in men, tanks, and supplies. The battle that followed, the Second Battle of El Alamein, was a test of endurance as much as strategy. When the British offensive began on October 23rd, the night sky erupted in artillery flashes that could be seen for miles. Rommel, temporarily in Germany due to illness, returned immediately to take command. But by then, the outcome was already sealed. For 12 days, his troops fought with desperate courage, counterattacking wherever gaps appeared. But the odds were impossible. Allied air superiority dominated the skies, and Axis fuel reserves were almost gone. On November 4, 1942, Rommel ordered a general withdrawal, the only choice to save what remained of his army. It was not a rout, but a disciplined retreat, executed under constant pressure, with rearguard actions buying time mile by mile. The Afrika Korps fell back through Libya toward Tunisia, chased by an enemy whose resources seemed endless. El Alamein marked the turning point of the North African campaign. For Rommel, it was both the climax and the beginning of the end. The man who had raced across the desert with unstoppable speed now faced the limits of logistics, attrition, and the growing industrial power of the Allied world. Yet even in defeat, his legend endured. Soldiers on both sides respected his conduct. Prisoners spoke of humane treatment, of a commander who valued honor even amid total war. The long reach of the Ghost Division had finally met resistance it could not outmaneuver. But the story of Rommel in Africa was not finished. The retreat would test him more than any advance ever had, and the lessons of El Alamein would echo across generations of military thought. The retreat from El Alamein was not a single movement, but a long, punishing ordeal that lasted months. For Rommel and the men of the Afrika Korps, it meant trading the initiative they had lived by for the grim discipline of survival. Their engines coughed out the last of their fuel, their tires shredded on the stony flats of Cyrenaica. The same landscape that had once been an open highway for his lightning tactics now became a trap of sand and stone. Every mile cost them another vehicle, another man. Allied bombers circled constantly, strafing the roads and supply columns. Rommel's command posts were little more than tents pitched behind sand ridges. He slept in his clothes, ate whatever the quartermasters could scavenge, and spent long hours hunched over maps that no longer offered good options. His dispatches to Berlin grew sharper in tone. He pleaded for ships, fuel, replacement tanks. The answers that came back were always the same: promises, excuses, empty optimism. The German High Command had shifted its attention to Stalingrad and the Eastern Front. North Africa had become a secondary theater. The men still fought hard. They ambushed pursuing British columns, laid mines, and used the terrain with their old cunning. But the momentum was gone. In January 1943, the remnants of the Afrika Korps crossed into Tunisia to join the Italian and newly arrived German units, forming a last line of defense. Rommel's health had begun to fail. Years of exposure, exhaustion, and the strain of constant command wore him down. Still, he organized the defenses with the precision that had once carried him to victory. Then came a brief reversal. In February 1943, near Kasserine Pass, American forces entered combat in North Africa for the first time. Rommel saw inexperience and acted instantly. With a mixture of German and Italian armor, he struck the Americans hard, breaking through their lines and scattering units that had never faced a commander of his caliber. For a few days, the old rhythm returned: surprise, speed, and confusion among the enemy. But even that victory could not change the strategic picture. The Allies were pouring men and equipment into North Africa. Axis supply routes were collapsing under constant naval and air attack. By March, Rommel knew the campaign was lost. He recommended withdrawal to Europe to save his forces, but Hitler refused. The orders were to fight to the last man. Rommel's loyalty was professional, not blind. He obeyed but privately concluded that such commands were madness. His letters to his wife reflected growing bitterness. Endless war, dying soldiers, promises that could not be kept. In early March, he finally collapsed from illness and exhaustion. Command of the Afrika Korps passed to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. Rommel was flown back to Germany for medical treatment, leaving behind an army he knew was doomed. In May 1943, the last Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. More than 250,000 men went into Allied captivity. The campaign that had once been Rommel's triumph ended in silence and dust. The Desert Fox was gone from the battlefield, but not from the story of the war. Back in Europe, he was celebrated as a hero, paraded through state ceremonies, awarded new commands. Yet, the shine had faded. He was given responsibility for defending the Atlantic coast of France against the expected Allied invasion. The man who had perfected mobile warfare in open space now had to supervise concrete fortifications. Static defenses he considered flawed from the start. He argued that flexibility, not walls, would decide the next phase of the war. Few in Berlin listened. The strain between Rommel and the Nazi leadership widened. He had never been a party loyalist. His focus was purely military. As reports of atrocities and the collapse of German fortunes reached him, his faith in Hitler disintegrated. By 1944, whispers of dissent spread among officers. Some plotted to remove the Führer entirely. Rommel was not part of the assassination plan of July 20, 1944, but his name was invoked by conspirators hoping for legitimacy. After the attempt failed, the regime turned its fury inward. On October 14, 1944, while recuperating at his home in Herrlingen, two generals arrived from Berlin. They brought Hitler's order. Rommel could face a public trial for treason, which would end with his execution and reprisals against his family. Or he could take his own life quietly, in exchange for protection of his wife and son. He asked for a few minutes, then stepped into the car that waited outside. Minutes later, he was dead from poison. The regime announced that he had died of wounds from an air attack. The truth would emerge only after the war. The fall of Erwin Rommel was not just the end of a man, but the end of an idea, the belief that individual genius could overcome the machinery of total war. In the deserts of North Africa, he had shown what speed, imagination, and courage could achieve. In the corridors of power, he discovered that even the finest soldier was still a pawn in a larger and darker game. When the war ended in 1945, the world that had once trembled under Rommel's lightning attacks lay in ruins, but his name survived the collapse. Among the ashes of the Third Reich, few German officers emerged with respect from both sides of the conflict. Erwin Rommel was one of them. Allied soldiers who had fought him in North Africa spoke of him with a strange mixture of admiration and relief. They had faced an enemy who fought hard, but observed a code. A commander who treated prisoners humanely, who refused to execute captured soldiers, who fought for tactical mastery rather than ideology. British Field Marshal Claude Auchinleck had called him a great general, if not the greatest of them all. Even Winston Churchill, standing in the House of Commons, paid tribute to his brilliance and courage. Historians still debate his legacy. Some see him as a military genius limited by impossible logistics. Others as a skilled tactician elevated by propaganda. But the facts are undeniable. With limited resources, Rommel achieved a level of operational tempo that reshaped modern warfare. His concepts of speed, deception, and flexibility influenced military doctrine for decades. Armored warfare schools across the world studied his desert campaigns as case studies in maneuver, initiative, and the psychological use of momentum. Yet his story is not just about tactics. It is a cautionary tale about loyalty, command, and conscience. Rommel served a regime he did not fully believe in, and in the end, that regime demanded his life. His death by forced suicide became a symbol of moral fracture inside the German officer corps, the moment when professional duty collided with the moral weight of history. Today, the legend of the Desert Fox endures because it speaks to both triumph and tragedy. He was a man of discipline and daring, a commander who could read a battlefield like few others, but also a human being crushed by the contradictions of his time. The sands of North Africa have long since swallowed the tracks of his tanks, but his influence remains etched in every discussion of leadership under fire. Rommel's campaigns taught the world that mobility is the heart of modern war, that no defense is secure if it cannot adapt, and that courage, without clarity of purpose, is never enough. The Ghost Division was not just a name. It was an idea. The belief that movement, imagination, and speed could overcome size and strength. In the desert, that idea came alive. As the years pass, the story of Erwin Rommel still compels because it reminds us how thin the line is between glory and ruin, between a commander's ambition and the cause he serves. His brilliance reshaped warfare, but his fall revealed the cost of genius tied to a doomed cause. If you were moved by this story, by the speed, the strategy, the humanity behind the legend, like this video, share it with history lovers, and subscribe to WWII Heroes Legends. Here, we keep the memory of real courage alive, one true story at a time.